Stories from the pages of time. Stories of triumph and tragedy, adventure and achievement, as we go in search of history. Return to the origins of modern man. Discover the Neanderthals who thrived in the face of frigid cold and mortal danger for 100,000 years, only to die out as the final step in man's evolution was about to begin. About 40,000 years ago, our ancestors took their first tenuous steps into an unknown land. After centuries of bitter cold, the last glaciers were finally in retreat from Europe. And it was here, in a gradually warming world, that the earliest people would settle the landscape and begin the story of modern humanity. They were our immediate ancestors, but they were not alone. Other beings far more ancient were already here. For over 100,000 years, their stocky, powerful bodies had helped them endure the bitter winds and sub-zero temperatures of repeated ice ages. And now, as the invaders, Homo sapiens, began spreading through their territory, contact was inevitable. They were the Neanderthals, a puzzling phenomenon in the saga of human evolution, and a creature long misunderstood by both science and laymen alike. Neanderthals were but one fragmentary moment in the long history of the human species. A century of intensive scientific investigation has revealed that we sprang from many ancestors, spanning millions of years. But of all our antecedents, none has captured our imagination as much as the Neanderthal. They are named after the Neander Valley near Dusseldorf in Germany, where the first fossils were found in 1856. Because of its European origin, the name has been pronounced differently over the years, but current consensus favors the use of Neanderthal without the H. The bones of over 1,000 have now been unearthed, more than any other species of early humans. But a lingering question remains. Were they a separate species, or are we related to them? Scholars disagree on the issue, yet there is something indefinable that seems to link us with these long-gone people.
I think we're so curious about the Neanderthals because they are so similar to ourselves. We're constantly trying to figure out how they're different, and the more that we learn about them, the more similar they become. And Neanderthals are constantly reminding us that the human way of doing things has been going on for a very, very long time.
Neanderthals left behind no pottery, no writing or records, so for scholars they are difficult to study. We know only that Neanderthals first appeared around 200,000 years ago. They thrived for over 100,000 years, then mysteriously died out. The question of where they fit into the overall pattern of our evolution is a controversial and highly debated one.
Over the years, Neanderthals have been either included within our species, Homo sapiens, or they've been separated out into a separate species, Homo neanderthalensis. And that reflects, in part, whether they're seen as directly ancestral to modern humans or as a side branch in human evolution.
The fossil record unmistakably reveals that our earliest ancestors first appeared in Africa around 4 million years ago. They would experience many evolutionary phases. One of their direct descendants, known as Homo erectus, meaning the man who walks upright, eventually migrated from their African homeland. Small bands of these hardy travelers would settle in Asia and Europe. While scientists agree that we all share a common lineage with Homo erectus, their descendants would evolve into distinctly different groups in various parts of the world. In Europe, they would become the Neanderthals. They inhabited a vast area of the European continent and the Near East. They ranged from Kazakhstan to the British Isles and thrived throughout the Mediterranean region. Yet at any one time, their total population may never have exceeded 100,000.
They were probably very thinly spread on the landscape, but judging by the number of sites we have, they were probably very, very low population density, and they did not spread north much beyond about England or Germany, or for that matter, around the Black Sea, further to the east.
The time of Neanderthal man was one of climatic upheaval and bitter cold. Over the more than 100,000 years that they existed, there were repeated glaciations, or ice ages, during which Europe was locked in the grip of advancing and then gradually receding sheets of ice. To survive these bleak conditions, Neanderthals must have been resourceful and inventive creatures, perhaps even being the first humans to wear animal skin clothing.
The only way to survive full glacial conditions that existed here during maximum glacial times was through the use of clothing and the implements that insulate humans from the extreme cold conditions. They certainly used all of those things. Whether intelligence played a lot to do with it is, I think, an open question. There's reason to believe that Neanderthals behaved differently than we did, but I'm not sure that means that they were less intelligent than we are.
Neanderthals were often on the move, fleeing encroaching cold for drier, warmer areas. Fortunately for science, Neanderthals sought shelter in caves. Many sites still contain fossils and traces of habitation. Today, a sharp eye and dedicated work with brush and pick will release their bones and unlock frozen moments of their long-vanished lifestyle. "30,000 years after the last of them became extinct, we can reconstruct the fossil evidence and resurrect the Neanderthal for study. Though clearly human, their faces would appear unusual today. Unlike modern humans, Neanderthal skulls were flatter and less dome-shaped. The most conspicuous difference was the sloping forehead and high, ridged brow above the eyeline. Compared to modern man, they had very pronounced noses. There was also an absence of a prominent chin. Despite these obvious physical differences, Neanderthals had large brains, sometimes even larger than our own.
There's reason to believe that a general principle in the animal world is that large brain size goes with large body size, and that the bigger an animal is, the larger its brain. If for no other reason than the motor structures that are required to drive a bigger body have to be bigger. Neanderthal brain size is that much bigger than ours, so as to have been accounted for by their slightly larger body size.
Neanderthals were an evolutionary triumph. Their bodies were perfectly suited to surviving a harsh and challenging environment.
The general level of strength is in their arms and shoulders in that region. It's probably something on the order of 2 or 3 times as strong as an average modern human in good physical condition. They evolved very stocky bodies with short limbs, which maximize the amount of body volume, and they minimize the amount of surface area, which is a very good way to stay warm in a cold climate.
Europe today is very different than it was at the time of the Neanderthals. It is a warmer and far more amenable place. The Dordogne Valley of southern France contains some of the richest traces of Neanderthal habitation to be found anywhere. Embedded in the rock of this cave are telltale traces of an ancient fire. This was to become one of the Neanderthals' most powerful aids to survival. We will never know when it first occurred, but Neanderthals, like Homo erectus before them, knew the secret of one of the most potent safeguards against their environment: fire.
There is evidence of people using fire that goes back 500,000 years ago, and perhaps more. We really don't know when people were systematically making fire as opposed to capturing natural fires and using it. It's very likely that it started at least by roughly 200,000 years ago. And so by the time of the Neanderthals, it was probably being made on a regular basis.
Fire was used not only for heat, but for preparing food, and undoubtedly as a protective barrier against wild animals. But in some instances, it also provided a more unusual function.
There's one famous cave where there's light ash found in the middle of the cave, not the kind of ash that you get when you burn wood. People have speculated about why the ash layers in the middle of the cave. I think people were putting down bedding in the middle of the cave, maybe reeds of some sort, and every once in a while they'd have to burn it all up to get the lice out, because there's no other way to delouse a cave but just to burn your bedding.
How intelligent were the Neanderthals? Early scientific theories about them speculated wildly. In 1908, the first almost complete Neanderthal skeleton was found here near La Chapelle in southern France. It would launch our initial view of these ancient people, yet cause one of the most dramatic misconceptions in the history of science. The bones were those of an elderly male and were dubbed the Old Man from La Chapelle. The knock-kneed form of his legs and a misshapen big toe were not recognized as physical defects. The forward-thrusting skull led researchers to initially believe that all Neanderthals stood awkwardly in a huddled, bent-over fashion. It was thought that they were clumsy beings of very low intelligence, and certainly in no way related to modern humans. Yet later findings contradicted the theory. What the first scientists did not realize was that the La Chapelle remains were those of an old man who was crippled by arthritis. The disease had horribly deformed him and probably made him stoop in agony for much of his life. It was this imperfect scientific interpretation that sealed our early view of the Neanderthals. Thus was born the image of a fierce, dim-witted, savage brute, club in hand and always on the warpath. Even Hollywood fostered the myth, portraying the Neanderthal as a comical human prototype.
I think Neanderthals are highly underrated. Often they're described as being barbarian, as being subhuman, as being half human, half animal, something along these lines. What I think is amazing about Neanderthals is how much they are like us, not how different they are from us. They've always been the outsiders, the different ones, the group that's somewhat human, but not human enough to be our ancestors in many people's minds. I think that's totally wrong.
Contrary to long-held belief, we now know that the average Neanderthal was not only physically nimble, but probably a very intelligent being. These were creatures who could reason, who had emotional attachments to one another. They established close social bonds. Indeed, they were very human, even caring for the sick and injured among them.
We have a number of skeletons of Neanderthals who had serious injuries. We have a couple of individuals who had injuries that were so serious that they simply couldn't fend for themselves, even long after the injuries were healed. We have a number of other individuals whose injuries healed over and had little effect on them in the long run, but they would have needed help and support while that injury was healing. That is, they were serious injuries, but they healed over and afterwards were fine. Some of these injuries we also know were ones that they sustained as children, and they survived them, they healed over, and then they lived through the rest of their adult life.
Many injuries may have been sustained during one of the Neanderthals' primary occupations, the perpetual hunt for food, which consisted largely of meat.
You're not dealing with hunting technology that allows you to make kills at nice, safe distances. You don't have bows and arrows. You don't have any firearms, etc. Kills have to be very up close and personal, exerting a great deal of energy.
As skilled hunters, Neanderthals could pursue the wide variety of animals that ranged throughout Europe at that time.
So we've got some idea of what animals Neanderthals ate. And the answer is that they ate across a very wide range. There are places where they ate water birds like swans and hares, and there's other places where they ate woolly rhino and mammoth and mastodon. So we know the range is quite wide.
With sophisticated weapons far in the future, the Neanderthals still met the challenge of feeding themselves in their harsh environment.
The Neanderthals had very effective stone tools, very sharp stone tools for butchering animals, for dismembering animals, cutting the meat off of them. It's very likely that they ate a certain amount of the meat raw, but they also cooked it. They had domesticated fire. They would have put the meat on it and roasted it. Very simply, if you can just think of taking a leg of lamb, sticking it on the fire, roasting the outer part of it, eating that off, their table manners were probably terrible.
Neanderthals were not the only creatures in quest of food. As they hunted, they may have come into conflict with other carnivores, becoming prey themselves.
Clearly, Neanderthals competed, in some cases lost that competition, with a wide range of other animals hunting for the same prey that they were. We know of sites, for example, where Neanderthal remains are actually found in the context of hyena dens, meaning that the hyenas went and scavenged the bodies of Neanderthals.
Neanderthals moved around their environment in small groups, frequently putting down their roots and taking up shelter in one place for long periods of time. What do we know of their social structure, their family units? The archaeological evidence provides clues.
From what we can tell from their signs, which are indication of how many people were likely to have been together at one time, They probably spent most of the year in small family groups, half a dozen individuals, perhaps as many as 10 to 15 individuals. It's also very likely that during the summertime, when food was more plentiful, when things were warmer, that they gathered in fairly large groups, perhaps 20, 30, 40 individuals, perhaps even more.
It was when ice covered the landscape, or even during an average winter, that existence became especially precarious. The search for food was always a challenge. At times, Neanderthals may have been forced into more desperate alternatives to survive.
It is very likely that when Neanderthals were starving and one of their group members died, that they saw that person as providing food for the survivors, what I call survival cannibalism. That almost certainly happened on occasion.
Life was perpetually harsh when Neanderthals walked the earth. Danger was seldom far away. Despite the constant rigors of a hostile and difficult environment, Neanderthals thrived for an astonishing length of years. Twice as long, in fact, as modern humans have thus far survived. But in the absence of writing, cave art, or other physical evidence, a lingering question always remained. Were these people able to communicate through speech and language? Then, one day in 1983, at a cave called Kibara in northern Israel, the dust and debris of a time long past gave up its secret. The first intact Neanderthal hyoid bone was found. This tiny, free-floating bone from the back of the throat is similar to that of a modern human and is essential for vocalization and speech.
This is the oldest known hyoid bone. It dates to approximately 60,000 years old, and it's in perfect condition. And this showed no significant differences in its form and its major size characteristics from modern human hyoid bones.
But if Neanderthals possessed the power of speech, did they have a language? Scientists have recently begun to make educated guesses.
Neanderthals almost certainly had language, and they had the vocal tracts that would allow them to have language, which includes spoken language as well as other kinds of communication, on a regular basis to communicate with each other, to exchange information. At the same time, their level of behavioral complexity, cultural complexity, was far less than what we see in modern humans, early modern humans, and so it's very likely that their language was a whole lot simpler than that we know in any living people.
I would like to know what language Neanderthals spoke and how it was related to modern languages. I think this would help us understand so much about them, their psyche, the way they looked at the world, and how they're related to us. If we just had some recording from a time machine of Neanderthal language.
Much of how we view the past is based on theory and speculation. Certainty can only come from tangible remains, such as fossils and sites where habitation occurred. Archaeological evidence proves that lifestyle, environment, and climate took their toll on Neanderthal numbers. Few would live beyond the age of 40.
It's hard to put a specific life expectancy age on it, or how long would they likely to live. But what we can say is that by the time a Neanderthal had reached the early 40s, that individual would have been essentially worn out.
Earlier than Neanderthals, we don't find people in their 40s. We find them in their 30s. I would have said that Neanderthals are probably the first people who regularly had grandparents. That is to say, people in their 40s who have grandchildren, because if you're dying in your 30s, you're not living long enough to have grandchildren.
Perhaps one of the most poignant examples of how close Neanderthals may have been to all that we term human was the fact that they buried their dead.
Neanderthals were the first people for whom we have evidence of burial of the dead. In a number of sites, there have been several and as many as 9 or 10 Neanderthal individuals found. Those are actually the most interesting ones because they very often involve other things besides simply interring the body, like small mounds of earth, like the incorporation of objects, or possible incorporation of objects in the graves.
In one grave, the corpse of a young male had been sprinkled with red ochre. In another, flints and stone tools had been interred with the body. Animal horns and even flower petals were found buried with Neanderthal dead. What could these objects mean?
I believe that the burials and the grave goods are direct evidence of belief systems because they reflect belief in an afterlife. I think there's no other sort of credible explanation for Neanderthal burials.
The fact that Neanderthals treated a human differently than they treated the animals that lived around them, that also occur in the caves where we find these burials, that in itself indicates that they had a symbolic interpretation of themselves and their role in the world. A Neanderthal was different from the other species around them, to Neanderthals, and they recognized that.
These graves and the objects buried within them seem to show the first stirrings of a religious consciousness, a belief in a life that transcends the grave. Perhaps Neanderthals were the first to recognize a deity or a god. We may never know. For scholars, delving into the enigma of the Neanderthals is grueling, back-breaking work. But when they come, the dividends are rich beyond measure. Each fragment of bone, each stone tool becomes another piece in an anthropological jigsaw puzzle, shedding light on human origins. Fortunately, Neanderthal remains are abundant and well preserved. Bones and archaeological dig sites speak eloquently of the kind of lives these primitive people once led. The males were the undisputed leaders of the community. But what do we know of the place of women and children in Neanderthal society?
Neanderthal women are very, very robust. They are undergoing daily as much stress as are the males. You look at the children, they're also quite stressed. There is also a lot of evidence for all kinds of accidents and traumas in Neanderthal skeletons. So we know these people are having tough, hard lives, men and women and children.
Females and children may often have been left alone as males went on extended hunting expeditions.
I think the guys are around, but they're not part and parcel of daily existence, nor are they socially integrated into any kind of units. Yeah, occasionally, the males probably do offer some food, but that food, I suspect, is not for provisioning the young, it's for females for sexual favors.
While much of Neanderthal behavior is based on conjecture, there is nevertheless surprising evidence of how women may have been treated by men.
Neanderthals had a low status regard for women. Women were treated poorly. And the reason I think this is true is because they generally didn't bother burying women. They buried the men. And when they did bury women, they never gave them grave goods. Men were always buried with flints, with bone tools, with other things that would help them in the afterlife. Women, never so. And even in cases like some of the French sites where a man and a woman were buried head to head, facing an east-west direction, clearly an intentional burial, the grave goods are with the man, there's nothing left with the women. So women aren't thought very well of, at least in terms of burial status. But usually burial status reflects something about social status.
As the drama of life played itself out on the plains and plateaus of Europe 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were no longer alone. While the descendants of Homo erectus had long spread throughout Asia and the South Pacific, a new breed of human had begun to move into Neanderthals' European domain. Soon, they would be on a collision course. Emerging possibly from Africa, the original cradle of mankind, these more advanced creatures were the Cro-Magnons, the first truly modern humans, or Homo sapiens. Taking their first tenuous steps into the mainland of Europe around 40,000 years ago, it was in the bridgehead between Europe and Africa in the Middle East that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals were first to meet.
When you have invading population, and in this case, the early modern humans, or Homo sapiens, or what is known in the professional jargon as Cro-Magnons, these guys were moving rather fast from east, meaning from the Middle East and adjacent areas, into Western Europe. These were people who were also hunters-gatherers, and therefore, theoretically, not much different from the European Neanderthals.
Neanderthals were the unchallenged dominant European species for over 100,000 years. But suddenly, all that was about to change. What happened when these two types of early humans came in contact with each other?
Neanderthals and early modern humans could have interacted in three different ways. One, avoidance, avoiding each other. Second, interbreeding, having a kind of relationship that would cause an interbreeding. And the third one is conflict. You can have a conflict and one group of hunters-gatherers would exterminate the other group.
But did conflict between them occur? At a cave called Cavemen in northern Israel, evidence has been found that Neanderthals and the Cro-Magnons lived alongside one another.
The most fascinating aspect of my own work in the case of Neanderthals and early modern humans is the fact that we find the remains of both of them in the same country within a short geographic distance. How did they use their sites, and what would have been their social structure, and what is the evidence actually for the behavior of this human is the most fascinating one. And the reason I find it fascinating is that I'm interested, like a lot of other archaeologists, in human evolution. You cannot understand human evolution only by looking at the fossils, only at the skeletal remains. You want to understand and to learn more about the behavior of these people. You want to know more about their social structure.
It remains one of the greatest unknowns of anthropology. How did Neanderthals react to the first modern humans, who were now laying claim to territory previously occupied by Neanderthals alone? Did antagonism arise between them? Who would have won a fight? Neanderthals were physically powerful, but the Cro-Magnons possessed the technological edge. They had far more sophisticated weapons. The fertile lands of northern Israel, where some of the first contacts between Neanderthals and migrating early modern humans occurred. Anthropologists know that these species lived very close to one another. Still unknown is whether the relationship was one of conflict and intolerance or mutual interaction.
We don't know exactly what went on, but it's very unlikely that they actually had any kind of armed conflict with those other people. That they probably kept their distance, or they may very well have, in certain areas, have met with them, interbred with them. After all, they were all people, and they would have recognized each other as people, despite the fact that they may have looked a little different, one from the other. If you have a couple hundred square kilometers and you have two groups of a dozen Neanderthals and two groups of a dozen early modern humans, there isn't a whole lot of competition for space, for resources. They're going to simply intermingle. They may recognize each other as different, but they're not going to worry too much about that. To them, they're just other people.
But not everyone agrees with the view that Neanderthals and the invading early modern humans would have been tolerant of one another. Their meeting may not have been as cordial as some believe.
This is, for the time being, in my view, an unresolvable question. And therefore, as an archaeologist, I would rather look at Neanderthals and early modern humans as two populations competing with each other. I think that early modern humans were among the exterminators of Neanderthals.
The nature of the relationship between Neanderthals and early modern humans remains an ongoing debate. But about 10,000 years after the first Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals came into contact with one another, the Neanderthals mysteriously died out. After having survived tumultuous climatic changes and other natural hardships for tens of thousands of years, they became extinct. The reason is still unclear. Perhaps they lost out to the intellectual superiority of the invaders, succumbing to their more efficient weapons. Certainly the Cro-Magnons were producing better tools and implements. It is possible that competition between the two groups finally eradicated the last of the Neanderthals from their European settlements, bringing about their extinction.
My strong suspicion is that if the Neanderthals and anatomically moderns were in an area together, they were not keeping apart. There would have been mixing and matching going on. I do not believe that anatomically moderns, the wonderful modern us, just swept across, killing everything in their wake, all the other life forms.
It's hard to understand a context in which two species so close in form, in structure, and in adaptation as modern humans and Neanderthals were, could coexist for the 5,000 or 10,000 or maybe longer years that we see them coexisting here in Western Europe, or for the immeasurably longer period of time that they coexisted in the Near East. They certainly couldn't have been different species competing for the same niche. They had to be able to interbreed. And the thing about people and all animals is that if they can interbreed and produce viable offspring, they will. If in contact, they will do it.
In some way, the Neanderthals may not have come to an evolutionary standstill. Perhaps they still live on. For although scientists may never fully agree, we could all be carrying Neanderthal genes within us today. In assessing the role played by these extraordinary people who once flourished despite enormous odds, we may perhaps learn something valuable about ourselves.
Looking at people in the past, to me, allows us to look at people who lived in harmony with their environment, who sustained a very long evolutionary trajectory. The Neanderthals lived for hundreds of thousands of years, maintaining their material culture, maintaining their economic traditions. It's not to say that they didn't go through hard times, surely they did, but they sustained their way of life for a very, very long period of time, far longer than we have.
I think we have a lot to learn about Neanderthals because they're a picture of a group of people with our capacities living in a harsh environment and adapting to it with very limited technology that tells us an awful lot about the power of the human mind and what people can do under the most adverse sorts of circumstances to understand how Neanderthals could persist in Europe during the worst series of glaciations that ever happened. So it really does give us insight into the human capacity in a way that we no longer can see because there's nobody that lives with that level of technology under conditions that are so difficult today. I think we learn a lot about ourselves, but we do so only if we're willing to admit that Neanderthals are ourselves.
Can we adapt as successfully as the Neanderthals did? Or will we one day be replaced by another species? Like specters from the distant human past, Neanderthals confront us with our own unique challenge. Will we prevail? Or will we vanish into extinction to be the object of some future species journey in search of history?